By the spring of 1917, the Great War had consumed the continent of Europe for nearly 3 years. The capacity to produce and transport material was as decisive as the courage of the infantry. While the popular history of World War I focuses on machine guns, mustard gas, and artillery, the logistical reality was that the war was built on wood. Timber was the silent skeleton of the Allied war effort. It was the structural component of the trenches, preventing the earthen walls from collapsing onto the soldiers. It was the duckboard beneath their feet that kept them out of the gangrene-inducing mud. It was the railroad tie that supported the supply trains, the pole that carried the telephone wires, and the planking for the temporary barracks that housed millions of men. France, the primary battleground of the Western Front, was exhausted. Its forests, managed for centuries with scientific precision, had been ravaged by the demands of the war or captured behind German lines. Great Britain, an island nation, relied heavily on imported timber from Scandinavia and North America. However, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany in the early 1917 had strangled these supply lines. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate, making the transport of bulky, low-density cargo like lumber dangerous. Every ship filled with timber was a ship that could not carry wheat, ammunition, or soldiers. The Allies faced a critical shortage of the very material needed to maintain their front lines. When the United States declared war on Germany on April 6 of 1917, the Allied powers, desperate for manpower and resources, sent immediate missions to Washington, D.C. The British delegation, followed closely by the French, presented a surprising priority to the American War Department. Before they asked for combat infantry or artillery, they asked for foresters. The Allies explicitly requested General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, to send lumbermen and forestry troops to aid the war effort before sending fighting soldiers. The logic was simple. The American army could not fight if it could not be housed, and it could not move if the railroads were not built. Furthermore, the British and French could no longer spare their own manpower to harvest what little timber remained in their forests. They needed Americans to bring their industrial efficiency, their equipment, and their skilled labor to the woodlands of France. The goal was to harvest French trees to build American bases, thereby freeing up Atlantic shipping lanes for vital munitions and food. The United States War Department, recognizing its lack of expertise in industrial logging, turned to the United States Forest Service for help. This partnership marked the beginning of a unique military experiment, the militarization of the American timber industry. In May of 1917, the formation of the 10th Reserve Engineers was authorized. This was to be a regiment of lumberjacks, the first of its kind in American history. It was designated as a pioneer unit, intended to arrive in France ahead of the main combat force to prepare the infrastructure for the millions of doughboys who would follow. The recruitment effort was spearheaded by the Forest Service, utilizing its network of rangers across the country. The call went out not for raw recruits to be trained, but for experienced men who already knew the trade. They sought sawyers, millwrights, fellers, skidder operators, and forest engineers. The advertisements boasted a grand vision, inviting men to join the largest regiment in the world, a prophecy that would come true as the Forest Service expanded, though it began with the modest 10th Regiment. Every soldier in the 10th Engineers was a volunteer. They were not draftees forced into service. They were men who stepped forward to apply their specific civilian skills to the defense of their country. The demographic profile of the 10th Engineers differed significantly from the average infantry regiment. Many of the men were old, seasoned by years of hard labor in the Pacific Northwest, the piney woods of the South, or the hardwood forests of the Northeast. They were tough men, accustomed to the dangerous, high-energy life of the logging camp. Alongside the lumberjacks came the professional foresters, college-educated men from the U.S. Forest Service who would serve as the officers and technical experts. Men like Major Edward E. Hartwick, a veteran of the Spanish-American War and a prominent lumberman from Detroit, exemplified their leadership. Hartwick commanded the 1st Battalion, bringing a mix of military discipline and industrial experience. Another key figure was George S. Keppert, whose memoirs and photographs would later provide a vivid window into the daily life of the unit. These men straddled two worlds, the regimented hierarchy of the Army and the pragmatic, results-oriented culture of the American timber industry. By August 1st of 1917, the recruits had gathered at Camp American University in Washington, D.C. For many of the lumberjacks, the transition to military life was a culture shock. These were men used to the freedom of the woods, where a man was judged by the amount of timber he could cut, not by how well he saluted. The 6 weeks spent at American University were dedicated to transforming these civilians into soldiers. They drilled, marched, and learned the basics of military discipline. However, the Army recognized that their value lay in their technical skills, not in their marching precision. The training was abbreviated, driven by the urgent need to get them to France before the winter set in. The atmosphere at the camp was one of frantic preparation. The regiment was equipping itself not just with rifles, but with tools of the trade, axes, saws, and portable sawmills. The Forest Service assisted in procuring the massive amount of industrial equipment needed to set up logging operations on a continental scale. The relationship between the 10th Engineers and the U.S. Forest Service remained tight throughout the war. The Forest Service did not just recruit the men, it provided the doctrine. Chief Forester Henry Graves and Colonel William Greeley ensured that the regiment followed the principles of sustainable forestry even in wartime. This proved crucial in their relations with the French, who were deeply protective of their shrinking forests. The men of the 10th were soldiers, but they remained foresters at heart. On Sunday, September 9th of 1917, the training ended. They traveled to New York, where their transport ship awaited. It was the RMS Carpathia. 5 years earlier, in April of 1912, she had been the first ship to arrive at the site of the Titanic disaster, rescuing over 700 survivors from the freezing Atlantic. Now she was painted in drab, wartime colors, serving as a troop transport. Boarding with the 10th Engineers were the 2nd Engineers, fresh from service on the Mexican border. Together, they represented the first 10,000 troops to be sent to France. For the men of the 10th, the voyage was a tense introduction into the reality of war. They were crammed into the ship's hold, sleeping in bunks stacked high, with the constant fear of a torpedo strike. Yet the Carpathia lived up to her reputation as a lucky ship. The convoy enjoyed an uneventful voyage, a fortunate outcome that was not shared by all. Later in the war, in July of 1918, the Carpathia was sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. The convoy arrived at Glasgow, Scotland, on the River Clyde. The arrival of the 10th Engineers was a historic moment. They were the first American troops to land in that historic city. The reception from the Scottish people was overwhelming. The docks were crowded with cheering civilians, eager to see their new allies. The enthusiasm was intense, a morale boost that the men would remember long after the war. It was a tangible sign that the United States had finally arrived to shoulder the burden of conflict. On the night of October 6 of 1917, they arrived in Le Havre, France. The 1st Battalion was deployed to the Landes region in southwestern France. The Landes was a unique geological and botanical environment, historically vast and swampy. It had been transformed in the 18th and 19th centuries by a massive planting of maritime pine to stabilize the drifting sands and drain the swamps. By 1917, it was one of the largest man-made forests in Europe. The terrain was flat but treacherous. The sandy soil made the environment of heavy equipment difficult, and the summer heat could be oppressive. The maritime pine was prized not just for its lumber, which was used for general construction and railroad ties, but for its resin. The French turpentine industry was active in the region, and the American engineers often had to work around these resinated trees that were being tapped by local workers. The timber here was smaller and softer than the firs of the mountains, suitable for pit props to support trench walls and railroad ties. The 1st Battalion quickly established operations, setting up sawmills and logging camps. One detachment of Company A, nicknamed Kellyville, or the Kelly Outfit, operated near Pontex. The name was a tribute to their commander, Lieutenant Kelly, who became one of the first casualties of the regiment. He was killed in a motorcycle accident while rushing to procure spare parts for the mill. The men of the 1st Battalion faced the challenge of the burn, a large area of the forest that had been damaged by fire. Harvesting this charred timber was dirty, grueling work. The soot coated the men and their equipment, and the abrasive charcoal dulled their souls. Yet they persisted, driven by the knowledge that every board they cut reduced the strain on the Atlantic convoys. While the 1st Battalion sweated in the sandy lands, the 2nd Battalion faced a completely different enemy, the cold. They were deployed to the Doubs region in eastern France, near the Swiss border. Their headquarters was at La Vire, situated in the Loire Mountains. This region was alpine in character, characterized by steep slopes, deep valleys, and heavy winter snowfall. The forests here were composed of spruce and fir, tall, straight trees that were ideal for heavy structural timbers and planking. The conditions were harsh. The winter of 1917 was one of the coldest on record, and the men of the 2nd Battalion often found themselves working in knee-deep snow and mud. It was here, in the freezing mountains of Doubs, that the 10th Engineers made history. On November 25th of 1917, Company F of the 2nd Battalion sawed the very first board cut by American troops in France. They used a small French sawmill while waiting for their American equipment to arrive. This symbolic moment marked the beginning of the American industrial effort in Europe. 2 days later, a fully American mill began operations at Motmir, signaling the start of mass production. The men of the 2nd Battalion took immense pride in their output. Company F set a regimental record by cutting 93,000 board feet of lumber in a single 10-hour shift. This feat was celebrated with a banquet, a rare moment of luxury in their hard existence. One of the defining conflicts of the forestry operations was a clash between American high-speed production methods and French conservationist forestry. The French sawmills used machines with multiple blades that cut slowly but efficiently, wasting very little wood. The Americans, used to the massive forests of the New World, preferred high-speed circular saws. These rotary mills could rip through logs at a furious pace but created more sawdust. The Americans were impatient with the French equipment. As soon as their own machinery arrived, shipped across the submarine-infested Atlantic, they built modern American mills. These mills were steam-powered, often using dinky steam engines to drive the main saw. The engineers amazed the locals by constructing these industrial plants in the middle of the forest in a matter of weeks, pouring concrete foundations or building heavy timber cribbing to support the machinery. Cutting the tree was only half the battle. Moving it to the mill and then to the railhead was often harder. In the U.S., loggers might use rivers or ice roads. In France, the 10th Engineers built an extensive network of narrow-gauge railroads. These light railways could be laid quickly through the woods to reach the felling sites. The engineers operated small steam locomotives on these tracks, hauling flat cars stacked high with logs. The temporary tracks were often uneven, leading to frequent derailments. Where trains couldn't go, the engineers used horses, tractors, to skid logs out of the brush. By the end of the war, the combined forestry forces had produced 272.5 million board feet of lumber and 2.73 million railroad ties. This production was sufficient to meet nearly all the timber needs of the Allies. The 10th Engineers had succeeded in their strategic mission. They had eliminated the need for a bridge of ships carrying wood across the Atlantic, freeing that tonnage for men and munitions. Life for the men of the 10th Engineers was a grind of 12-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. Their camps were often isolated, miles from the nearest town. In the beginning, they lived in tents, which offered little protection against the French rain. Mud was everywhere. It turned the camp streets into swamps and sucked the boots off the men's feet. Eventually, they built wooden barracks using their own lumber, making their living conditions more bearable. Food was a standard army ration: bully beef, which was canned corned beef, beans, hardtack, and coffee. Fresh meat and vegetables were rare treats. The men supplemented their diet by purchasing eggs and produce from local French farmers, with whom they generally maintained good relations. The 10th Engineers arrived in France in 1917, sparing them from the horrors of the flu ships of 1918, where hundreds died during the crossing. However, the 1918 influenza pandemic did not spare them once they reached the continent. The crowded barracks and the physical exhaustion of the men made them vulnerable. The flu swept through the camps, impacting hundreds and killing many. It was a terrifying, invisible enemy that struck healthy men down in hours, turning their lungs into fluid. For a unit that prided itself on physical strength, the helplessness against the virus was a heavy psychological blow. Despite the hardships, morale remained high. The men were united by their professional identity. They knew their work was essential. They produced the ties for the railroads that carried the shells to the front. They cut the planks for the hospitals that treated the wounded. After the war, the veterans formed an association called the Carpathians, named after the ship that carried them over. They published pamphlets and rosters, maintaining a connection that lasted for decades. This bond was forged in the mud of the Lands region and the snow of the Doubs region, a shared memory of hard work in a foreign land. As the American war effort grew, it became clear that a single regiment of foresters was not enough. The War Department authorized the formation of the 20th Engineers, a massive super regiment that would eventually encompass all forestry operations. In late 1917 and early 1918, the 10th Engineers was formally absorbed into this new structure. Despite the official change, the men of the original unit stubbornly clung to their identity as the old 10th. They were the pioneers, the first ones in, and they looked down slightly on the new arrivals. They wore their original insignia with a pride and continued to refer to themselves by their old company designations in their letters and diaries. The armistice on November 11th of 1918 brought an end to the fighting. The journey home was slow. The 1st Battalion moved to the port of Brest in January of 1919. Brest was infamous among the doughboys as a hellhole of mud and rain. While waiting for their ships, the skilled foresters were used as common laborers, coaling the battleships USS New Hampshire and USS New Jersey. The 1st Battalion sailed on the USS New Jersey on January 14th of 1919, arriving in Newport News, Virginia on February 1st. The 2nd Battalion followed on the USS North Carolina. By mid-February 1919, the regiment was dissolved. The men took their discharge papers and scattered back to the forests of America. The 10th Reserve Engineers demonstrated that a skilled group of volunteers organized along industrial lines could achieve logistical miracles. They saved the Allies millions of tons of shipping and provided the material backbone for the American victory on the Western Front. Their legacy lives on in the 20th Engineers, which remains an active unit in the United States Army today, tracing its lineage back to those first volunteers.